All right, for some analysis, now we're joined by Visiting National Relations Professor, Professor John Stremlau. Prof, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. A maybe more elaborate presentation by President Cyril Ramaphosa at the BRICS summit, more elaborate than the one we saw last week, where he just merely said, well, the ICC must investigate war crimes being committed by Israel in Gaza.
Well, sure, but these are still, and I happen to agree with him, but they're just words. What seems to be so striking, and I was just listening to a podcast by journalists who were in the Gaza and seeing for their own eyes the wanton destruction of everything, that it is tantamount to ethnic cleansing. Now, the international community, as we learned during the anti-apartheid struggle, can play a conditioning role on the parties to a dispute. But this is a dispute that lacks visionary leaders, that lacks leaders that are willing to take ownership on any solution, any peace process. So that you're really in a terrible situation where all you can do is point to the humanitarian disaster. And I gather that there is in the works a 3 to 5 day ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, to allow for some hostages to be released, but also to allow for humanitarian assistance to come in. But these journalists that I was just listening to, commenting on the scenes, everything is destroyed. Everything is destroyed, and there's no people where there used to be, 1 million or 2 million people. It's empty. It's like a ghost yard. It's frightening, and this magnitude of response, which is a war of revenge, is tantamount to ethnic cleansing. And so Cyril Ramaphosa is right to ask the ICC to investigate and to hopefully indict the leaders of Israel who have perpetrated this, but they don't feel they're any way wrong because they are operating on an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But in fact, there are now 13,000 civilian casualties, many of them kids and premature babies, for heaven's sakes, even, but not soldiers, because we don't know how many Hamas soldiers there are. But that's 10 times the horrible killings that went on among civilians when Hamas first broached the fence. Yeah. And so you're in this in this cycle. So I don't mean to go on so long, but it is important for your listeners or your viewers to put it in perspective.
Absolutely, and it's those kinds of numbers that are bringing about a whole lot of debate, because one of the speakers I spoke to yesterday on Israel and Israel recalling its ambassador, saying that even those numbers that we are talking about as the media of 13,000 are numbers that we are given by Hamas, but there is no independent verification of those numbers. What do you say to that?
Well, there is, the representative of the Gift for the Givers, for heaven's sake, was killed, and there have been a number of journalists, Palestinian journalists, and they're not all Hamas. They're Palestinians that are trying to have their homeland somehow protected. It's always been an open air prison, for heaven's sakes. I visited it for the first time in the 1980s, and it looked and smelled and felt like apartheid, only much more intense and much more limiting and much more confining in so many ways. So I don't think, we can quibble about the numbers. I've heard 15,000 but the fact is that there are enough pressures from Western allies of Israel, whose own populations are being totally offended by this disproportionate, forceful response. There has to have been a better way. When the Pakistanis attacked the Singh regime in India, he just waited and he said, well, I'm going to respond, but I'm not going to do it so right away. I'm going to be more deliberate. And in fact, he did isolate and you've got to get more new leadership in Palestine. Abbas is 87 and Hamas simply won't negotiate with the Israelis, and the Israelis won't negotiate with them, as far as I can tell, other than this proximity that the Western powers, including the United States, have been pressing for a ceasefire, a brief ceasefire, but not the kind of comprehensive ceasefire that Cyril Ramaphosa is talking about, because that's just not going to happen right now. There's just too much bitterness and venom. It's a terrible, terrible situation. But I think the more that the publics in not only in South Africa but also in Washington and in Europe and elsewhere put pressures on their governments to lean on the Israelis. The Israelis are losing the political war while they're winning, but it's not clear that they're winning anything, because we don't know how many forces there are in Hamas and where they are. They're clearly not in the basement of the hospital.
Yeah. In that pressure that we are piling on, we saw now the parliament in South Africa voting to close the Israel embassy. We saw Israel recalling its ambassador. I mean, is that something that would be a useful tool, I suppose, in the arsenal of peace diplomacy for the government of South Africa to certainly do as the parliamentarians have voted?
Well, it does respond to the public outrage here. Whether it is going to accomplish anything in Israel, I doubt it. I've been arguing all along since the very beginning of this conflict, although I've stressed that there's no obvious leadership willing to take ownership in a peace process, as there was in the early late 90s and early 2000. But it would be helpful to go ahead and proceed with trying to keep the South Africans' credibility with the Palestinians and the Americans' credibility, although that's being strained right now with the Israelis, even though this right-wing government is really extremist. It's the worst government from my perspective of any Israeli government in history. But I could say that about Donald Trump, and he can come back in the next election. So who knows? But the point of the process is that you need to keep diplomatic communications going. Now, South Africa could, if it severs relations with Israel, have a friendly embassy cover the responsibilities of looking after South African citizens who happen to be in Israel and vice versa. But I remind you that it's been 50 years since America had any diplomatic relations with the state of Iran, and Iran is now a BRICS member, for heaven's sakes, and there was to be a non-proliferation treaty, but the U.S. couldn't deal directly with the Iranians because they haven't found a way to restore relations. And so breaking relations is likely to be a long-term process, and there are a lot of pro-Palestinian Jews in South Africa, of course, as you know, from their commentary in the media.
Well, we know what South Africa is doing. We know what the president of South Africa, as the chair of BRICS, would want to see the other countries do. But what can that bloc actually do? What can Brazil, Russia, India, and China do, of course, you put it in relation to what South Africa is doing?
Well, you know, the Indian prime minister has not come, and he sent his foreign minister, and that may be he's hedging his bets a little bit. The Argentinians, which is a new member of the BRICS, just elected a Trump wannabe who sounds to be a real threat to the democracy there, but nevertheless takes a view that he doesn't want any part of the BRICS. I don't know whether that's going to happen, but all of these countries are still sovereign nations, and so I look upon the BRICS as basically a China vehicle that is comparable to the American role in the G20. Now, the BRICS members, the core BRICS members, are all members of the G20, so it's a bit more open system. But it is important, I think, for the Chinese to play a diplomatic role in the region, and they are reaching out, and that's probably a good thing. So, but it's the major powers, unfortunately, that wield considerable influence and do have the resources to perhaps apply. And the debates going on in the United States is very interesting to watch for me to watch, because there is enormous groundswell of support for the Palestinians not being genocided and not being ethnically cleansed and not being forced out of what is, after all, their homeland, and they've already been squeezed. And the fact that armed settlers in the West Bank are gunning for Palestinians, apparently, according to the news reports, is also another deadly sign of the religious passions of blood are stronger than constitutions like South Africa has, that is an inclusive democracy.
Professor John Stremlau, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on Wits International Relations Professor there, John Stremlau.